Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1500 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. Today we have a Vienna game with e4, e5, knight c3. We had a Vienna game in the last episode where my opponent cheated and his account has promptly been banned, so fair play to chess.com, but it was incredibly obvious. You can check out that video if you're interested. It took me a while to catch on, to be fair. But okay, so here we have the Max Lang defense with knight c6. I go over every single line of the Vienna Gambit, the Vienna Game. We have the Vienna Game now in like a 1 hour plus video I have on my channel of the complete Vienna opening guide. And my opponent goes knight to f6, which is the main line. There's some very interesting lines that can occur after bishop to c5, and I do have some videos on my channel in that, where we can go queen g4 and immediately try to exploit the weakened g7 pawn. Note that it doesn't quite work for black here, because after queen g5, knight f3, and queen to g2, we have rook g1, queen to h3, only save square, and then we have bishop takes f7 check, king takes, and knight to g5 check, winning the queen. Pretty cool line. But okay, we have knight to f6, and we're going to go play pawn to d3. We do want to play the move f4, which is the main idea of the Vienna, but because my opponent starts with knight to c6, we have to delay it a bit and build up support for the move f4. We also want to ensure that we stop the move d5 by adding a ton of attackers to that square. My opponent goes bishop c5, and we're going to play f4. And these lines can be incredibly sharp, because we both are eyeing the weak f7 and f2 squares with our bishop. We both also exert a lot of pressure over the d4 and d5 squares. Like, I'm controlling black's d5 square, and black is controlling my d4 square, right? It's a square in my territory. And by playing f4, I'm also weakening the diagonals around my king pretty severely. But it is absolutely fine. We'll continue with knight to f3. We want my opponent to take on f4, and then we will happily take back and have some very quick development. In some of those lines, you may even play queen d2 and castle queenside, because one of the potential issues in this line is the fact that we can't castle because this bishop is controlling the g1 square. And of course, because we have moved the f-pawn, we can't really block that. But these lines are very, very interesting. And okay, we have bishop to g4. And I believe knight to a4 is the move. Basically, I will show you after the game, but this can become very uncomfortable for white very quickly, namely because we can't castle. Now, one of the main moves in this position is castle's kingside for black, in which case we can play f5 and shut this bishop out of the game, which is very nice. Another one of the moves is a6, so that knight to a4 can be met with bishop to a7, maintaining the control of the diagonal, in which case I believe we can still play the move f5, locking this bishop away. Also opening up our dark squared bishop, and you can see how we could start to form attacking ideas. Also, the bishop can never block on e6 because we control that square. So bishop g4, you know, a move like h3 here isn't great. And I'll show you after the game. You have to be very precise here because we have weakened our king very, very heavily. After something like h3, bishop f3, queen f3, knight to d4, typically, you would go queen to f2, guarding the c2 square in the Vienna. But that's more so when the bishop is on a square like e7, because now, of course, you're lining yourself up with the bishop. So after like h3, take, knight d4, knight d4, queen f2, and knight to b3, we would be in a lot of trouble. My opponent voluntarily takes, which I do not understand. I assume the idea is that after queen takes, which is obviously forced because our queen's under attack, yeah, that he plays knight to d4. And he hits my queen, he hits my c2 pawn. However, I'm sure that we're okay here. So queen f2 is the move I want to play. The idea being that this knight can't move to a useful square, because it can check us on these squares, but we can take it on those squares. And a move like knight to b3, we can just take the bishop, and if knight takes a1... is that okay, actually? Yeah, we'd probably just take on b7, and this knight is just trapped. So we'll castle, we'll move the bishop, and we'll win the knight. It's just trapped in the corner. However, after queen to f2, I'm a little bit concerned about knight g4, hitting the queen, and that doesn't look very fun. So what else can we do? What else can we do? Well, the only other move that seems to make sense is queen back to d1, which isn't a move I really want to play, but I also don't see an alternative. Okay, b5, that's definitely a move, but I think we can just take. I think we can just take. Knight takes. If take here. Oh, that's actually alright, to be fair. Okay, what else can we do? We could go pawn to c3. And if take. I don't know. I don't know if I love that. Don't know if I love that. Okay, knight takes c5. If you take the bishop. My knight doesn't have a whole lot of squares. This is a really interesting line. Really interesting line. Because the knight comes here with tempo on my queen and on c2 so that it can defend the b5 square. Which is a really good concept. And there's no good way for me to kick the knight away that I can see. Well, I think I have to take the bishop, because at the end of the day, I'm in a double attack, right? And I can't take, and c3 seems far too complicated. Maybe the idea is to take on e5, to try to distract this pawn, and if take, we should be okay. That makes sense to me. If take... Yeah, I don't have to worry about this diagonal at all, because also this knight can't move forwards because we control these squares. So let's take on e5. I think probably the best line for black would be to take the knight. I guess. Yeah, he goes for it. Really good play from my opponent. Let's take on f6. Queen f6. Materials currently equal. And how do we continue? How do we continue? Black has no useful checks. Our king, of course, looks very bare. But queen h4 can be met with the move g3. So I'm tempted to just play the move c3, open up my queen's access to a4, and just boot the knight away, basically. Which I don't really see a reason not to play. It's just a good move. So let's get rid of the knight. So let's say knight back to c6. I suppose black has a horrific pawn structure, right? And material is equal, like I said. So something like knight c6, bishop e3, hitting the c5 pawn. Maybe rook d8 going after d3 is a good idea for black. That's definitely an option. d3 is weak. So if knight to c6, maybe we should just take on c4. Something like castle's king's side. And we're up a pawn, but e4 is very weak. Although we do have to move queen to f3. However, if knight c6 and we take, then queen h4 makes sense. So like let's say we take on c4 right now. Then queen h4 g3, the e4 pawn is undefended. Whereas if black were to play it now, the pawn is defended, right? So knight goes to e6, which I thought c6 was better, because here I thought I had queen to a4 check, which I'm going to play. And I think that we're completely winning now, because the problem is the knight disconnects the queen's control of the c6 square. At least this is how I'm interpreting the position. So the king has to move, right? So let's say king to f8, which obviously blocks this rook out of the game. But more than that, I get... Or king e7 as well, sure. But more than that is I get to take on c4 with the queen, which means that the e4 pawn is incredibly well defended, and I don't have to double my pawns and isolate my e-pawn. Which means that this is a non-threat, because if queen h4, like I said, we just go g3, and we're fine. So this looks very, very promising. Really happy with how this has turned out. We're up a pawn. We can play bishop to e3, developing with tempo, which I see no reason not to play. Yeah, let's play it. Again, if this... I also have the option of bishop to f2, if I want it now, which is nice. And we are... Yeah, I'd say we probably are threatening the c5 pawn. Although, to be honest, that pawn is probably going to fall no matter what. I mean, black could be stubborn and play a move like queen to e5 to defend. But then I just castle kingside, because you take your eyes off of the f1 square, and I'm just up a clean pawn, and your king is still in the center of the board. Which is very good. Alternatively, if, let's say, king to f8, black tries to dart the king away, I don't think I want to take. I really like my bishop. It's dominating this knight. Like, this relationship between a knight and bishop with two squares between is very common. I talk about this on the channel a lot. I don't have a good, like, name for this. I should probably come up with one. Maybe, like, knight-bishop opposition or knight-bishop domination. But the bishop controls all of the knight's forward movement. And yeah, queen e5 is played as partially predicted. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I know you're going to love the rest of the content on this channel if you enjoyed this video. So yeah, queen e5, I thought this was a bad move because I can just castle kingside. And of course, castling queenside would be fine. It would bring the rook to the d1 square defending d3. But there are open lines against my queenside, right? So I'd rather go kingside because, well, the black king is already on the kingside. Like, he's not really going to run to the queenside with this pawn structure, right? Also, we have rook to f5 here, which looks incredibly strong. Yes. But on the king side, the idea is that it's much more safe because, I mean, black, because of his pawn structure, has no open lines against my king. So hopefully that makes sense. My opponent attacks d3 and gets out of the way of the attack of the rook. We do have rook to d5, which again I think makes a lot of sense. Disconnecting the queen from d3. So the queen goes to c6. Interesting. Well, here, part of me wants to take on c5. If the king moves... we probably just take here. Yeah. Yeah, that looks fine. If bishop takes... Knight takes... I think rook takes makes the most sense. Because if queen takes, rook takes, then rook takes d3. Although I do have rook takes c7 in that line. And I'm up, what, 2 pawns? Yeah, 2 pawns, which is nice. Technically, there's no rush, but I also think that this is just a clear-cut win. So, okay, yeah. I think if the king moves, then I can just take the rook. If the knight takes, then we have 2 options. Either we take with the rook, hitting the queen. Let's say queen to b6, pinning the rook and attacking b2. So here. Then d3 is defended, but I think it's better to take with the queen. Force a queen trade, rook d3, rook c7 check. Let's say king to f6 runs into rook f1. King f8. With the rook on the 7th rank, that looks very, very good. So I'm going to go for that endgame. Up 2 pawns should be very nice, and also there's an incredibly passive rook. If my opponent doesn't take, and let's say he plays a move like rook to rook 8 d8, piling up pressure, or that, I suppose. That's not a bad move, actually. Although we can just play b3. I don't know if that's good, on second thoughts. Because now you're weakening a7. And to be honest, you're helping my structure. Because if you take on d3, and something like take king to e8, I want to put the pawn on c4 anyway to create this pawn chain. So that looks pretty good. My point was that if a move like rook a to d8, then I'll just play pawn to d4, and then you're never getting into my position, right? So you have to go for this. Let's take on c7. King to e6. Okay. So if here, we have two connected passed pawns. But I think I prefer the move c4. Creating this very strong pawn chain. I still have a passed pawn on c4. But my idea being that a7 is still weak. Instead of trading the pawns, I'd rather strengthen my own pawn and leave this a7 pawn very vulnerable. If a move like rook to d7 defending, of course I'm happy to trade. That endgame is very winning. When you get into these rook endgames, where it's like two rooks and pawns, typically, a good rule of thumb is that the defending side has better drawing chances with both rooks still on the board, because they can work together to create like perpetual checks, or to create better counterplay because they can work together to attack pawns. Okay, rook a7 seems like a no-brainer, going after the pawn and keeping the pressure on the 7th rank. And because of my excellent pawns, the black rooks can't actually defend. They can't defend. Rook e3 might be a good try, going after the e4 pawn. Yeah, he goes for it. But I think we have a very clever move with king to f2, baiting this and then going rook e1, forcing a trade of rooks. Let's say pawn to f5, we take on a5, and the pawn just can't be defended. I think this is the most accurate move. Which seems odd, because of course we could just take on a5, right, and trade the pawns. But, as I just said, the defending side, which here is obviously black, because he's down 2 pawns, would probably prefer to keep both rooks on the board. Because, like I said, it creates better chances for counterplay. Whereas the attacking side, which is obviously us, because we're up, well, 1 pawn currently, but you can't defend this pawn. That's the whole point. And you can't deliver a check to rotate the rook to e5, because, of course, the king is in the way. I want only 1 set of rooks on the board for each player, because then counterplay is significantly reduced. So hopefully that makes sense. That's a good kind of rule of thumb for rook endgames. And we're about to win this a5 pawn, and then it's just game over, because we have 3 connected passed pawns. The a2 pawn is the base of the pawn chain, which will be very well defended. And we can basically just march up the board, and there'll be very, very little that black can do about it. Of course, black has a pawn majority on the king side, but 1, my king is very close, so that'll be hard to actually do anything with. And 2, the pawns are on their starting squares, which means it's going to take forever for black to actually do anything with the pawns. But he starts the process. Let's take with tempo, but I mean, he wants to push the pawns up anyway. Black is just out of time. There's no time for him to create the counterplay that he needs to try and draw this game, because even if he gets the pawns through a bit, right? Even if he makes some progress, a 3-on-2 isn't that big a majority. My king is very close by. My rook can always swing over to help out if I need to. And I mean, for the time being, my rook is cutting off the king's ability to enter the fray, right? And while my opponent's dealing with trying to push the kingside pawns, I'll just continue with c5. And then the rook will have to move to defend, and then I'll play b4. And I mean, that will be that, essentially. I mean, also, if a move like h6, let's say, we could play rook to a6 check, picking up the h6 pawn if we want to be very clinical. It seems like my opponent has disconnected and will just abort the game, so I'll pause the video and see what he does. Oh no, he's back. Is he going to play a move? Come on now. Come on. Okay, he has played a move. He's played pawn to f6. G4 looks like it makes sense here. Clamp down on these squares. But I also don't think it's necessary. I think it's a bit of a waste of time. So instead, I'm going to offer a rook trade. But more than that, I know my opponent can just move the rook. The point is that then the b3 pawn is defended, so I can advance the a pawn without worrying about the b pawn falling. And then I can go something like this. And the outside passed pawn is, of course, the strongest, because if the c pawn advances, the king can kind of help out in the defense. Also, if I move the c pawn, my rook gets cut off from the 5th rank, and while it's winning regardless, it's far easier if my rook can control the 5th rank. I'm also really interested to check out the computer's analysis of the opening, because the way my opponent played it was very interesting with this whole knight d4 followed by b5 idea. No clue if that's good for white or black, but we'll find out. Okay, pawn to a4 is obvious, defended by this. And also just this rook does nothing now. It's looking at absolutely nothing. If pawn to f5, I can just play pawn to a5, and I can give a check and advance the pawn to a6 if I want to. The position kind of plays itself, right? My rook just advances with the pawns, and my king is always on standby to guard any kind of passed pawn that black can create. Like I said, g4 at some point may be the best move, but it's unnecessary because it makes it easier for black to... Like, for example, black could even try to sacrifice the h-pawn to get the f-pawn through quicker. Now, objectively, that is probably completely losing, right? But it's unnecessary counterplay. There's no need to give black anything like that. No need whatsoever. So I'd rather just leave the pawns on their home squares. I mean, the king is technically on its home square as well. And make black waste a ton of time trying to get to me while I'm blocking his king and while the pawns struggle to advance without being taken. So let's push a5. Continue the plan. And my opponent will, I assume, play the move pawn to h4, trying to come forward. And then, I mean, we have loads of moves, realistically. A move like rook to d5 is maybe quite nice. Is it? No, actually. No. If h5, sorry, h4, it's probably easier to give the check and then play pawn to a6. Because if the king tries to come over to the king side, I mean, one, the f6 pawn is always weak, so you'll have to waste a move moving that forward. But if the king steps away from the e-file, then I'll just push the c-pawn, and the king won't be able to get back and defend it like it currently can. Because if now I push the c-pawn, then the king can come to d5. And it's a little bit annoying, right? A little bit annoying. So we'll see what he does. See what he does. He's spending quite a while on these moves. It seems a little bit unnecessary. What I'll actually do is I'll pause the video, I'll play out the rest of the game, and then I'll just show you afterwards because this is taking way too long. Okay, so we left off around here with pawn a4. The game is over. I'm just going to show you what was played. Pawn to a5, f5, and pawn to b4, supporting the a5 pawn. My opponent kept pushing on the king side, but like I said, it's way too slow. Oh, that's not what I was meant to do. Yeah, he keeps pushing. We go pawn to c5, inviting the king in, but it doesn't matter. We can just go rook to b6. My opponent instead goes pawn to g4. We give a check on b6. The king advances, and we go pawn to c6. My opponent goes rook c8. And here you could defend your pawn with pawn to b5, but I played the more clinical pawn to a6, sacrificing the c6 pawn. My opponent accepts the sacrifice. We take, king takes, and we play this very important move, b5. Now, if we were to play a move like king here, we'd still be fine because king b6, we still go b5. And if king to b5, stopping b5, then just pawn a7. But the point is that after b5 check, the king can't take because we advance the pawn. We're trying to bait the king to the 5th rank. And if the king goes to b6, which it did, then we can bring our king to clean up all of these pawns. The king can never take because we push, and king a7 obviously does nothing, right? So my opponent went pawn to f4, and here find the easiest way for white to win. I would say not pawn to g3. This is actually a draw after take, and pawn to h3. Our king can never leave this area, otherwise this pawn will promote. And this black king can never leave a7, otherwise we'll promote. And this is actually a draw. So not pawn g3, but instead pawn to h3. And black has two options. Either he plays pawn g3 check, we go king f3, eat up the pawns, and we're completely winning. Or he plays what he did in the game, which is g takes h3, g takes h3, and my opponent resigns because we will eat this pawn, and push this pawn. If the king comes over here, then we'll just promote this pawn. So let's get into the game review. Again, sorry about my opponent. He spent like 2 minutes every move. It was very annoying, but hopefully you guys don't have to suffer that. And okay, so 92.2% accuracy for us. Very, very nice. And our opponent with 85.9%. The opening, very interesting. So we start with a Vienna with pawn e4, pawn e5, knight to c3. As I said, I've got loads of games on my channel in the Vienna Game, in the Vienna Gambit, and I have a full video guide to the Vienna opening, if you're interested in learning it for yourself. My opponent goes knight c6, and we go bishop to c4, piling on the pressure to d5. Knight f6, d3. One of the main lines here is knight to a5, doing kind of what we did to our opponent, but in reverse, going after the bishop. The line that I personally like is bishop back to b3, knight b3 and a b3, opening up the file for our rook. Black can play the move d5 here, and you can get some interesting lines with something like take. You can go knight to f3, you can go queen to h5, like something like queen h5. Apparently knight b4 is the best move here, but the point is bishop d6 is the natural move to defend d5, but then we just have knight takes d5. And of course, black could maybe blunder something like this, which would be very kind. Although there is queen to e7, queen e7, knight e7, but we are up a pawn and winning. But okay, my opponent goes bishop c5, and we go pawn to f4. Technically, black is slightly better, but there's some incredibly interesting lines here for white. So pawn d6 is the main line. We go knight to f3, applying pressure. And as I said, let's say a move like castles here. White can play the move f5, right? And these can be super interesting positions because the light squared bishop is completely locked out of the game. And we can apply a ton of pressure to the king side if we can form an attack correctly. If nothing else, though, if black wastes time, let's say he gives his bishop an escape route, we are doing very well after something like bishop to g5. If pawn h6, we just drop back. There's no g5 because of this. And remember, this pawn is pinned to the king, so it isn't actually controlling f7. Sorry, g6. And I don't know, a move like bishop to d7, we have knight to d5. And because d6 has been played and this bishop can't get back, the knight is so weak. And the computer actually wants to sacrifice the queen. It thinks that this is the best line. And after this, it wants to try and play this position, which is obviously very bad for black. But bishop g4 is a good move, and we go knight to a4, which is the best response, going after this bishop. Now my opponent takes on f3, which I thought was very strange, and went knight d4, justifying the move. As I said, I really wanted to play queen to f2, with the idea being that if this knight tries to move, right, it can't move with a check. And if the knight moves to a square like b3, right, hitting the rook and the queen, then after take, I was going to play f takes e5, which the computer likes. If you take, then I take. And after d takes e5, I can just castle, and the knight is trapped. So we'll get 2 pieces for the rook, and we'll get a couple pawns as well. So very, very good. The issue is, however, that there is knight g4, which is why I rejected this move, because then we have to play queen g3 and give this up, and I mean, this looks very, very strange. So queen d1 is the best move. My opponent goes b5. Okay, the computer wants to play bishop f7 check, a move I briefly looked at, but couldn't seem to justify. After knight c5, dc5, fe5, the knight can't advance forward, so knight back to e8, c3, knight e6, castles with check, king g8, bishop e3. The computer thinks we get 2 pawns for the piece, and that this is playable. I suppose we do have ideas of d4, d5, which could be very nice. And the knights are basically dominated by my bishop and my pawns, right? And I suppose this diagonal is also very weak, and the king is very weak. But I played knight c5, which is considered a mistake, but the position is completely equal. bc4. This doesn't make quite as much sense. Again, the computer wants to go for take, take, take. But even a move like bishop to b3 is just fine. If knight takes, pawn takes, take, take, I mean, material is equal, but the black pawns are very weak, and we have a very nice bishop, and we have very nice control of the center. So he goes bc4. We go f takes e5. With the idea being that if you take like this, then we go c3, and you can see how things can open up against the black king. The computer actually wants to castle, and if take, then after queen takes, apparently black is winning. So we have to do this. Okay, very interesting. But fe5, my opponent takes on c5, we take on f6, queen f6. Black is slightly better. I go pawn c3, which is deemed an inaccuracy. But black's only move is knight to c6, which is what I was expecting. And the computer, interestingly, after queen f6, prefers rook f1, which I rejected on the grounds of queen h4 check, hitting the king and h2. If g3, we're completely losing. But the computer believes that after this, now we go c3. Now if knight back, we do this, and this is apparently a draw after this repetition. Okay. I go c3, though. Again, knight c6 is the move. It just is. And after a move like bishop to e3, I was expecting a move like rook to d8, going after the pawn. The computer, however, believes that queen to f3 holds on. And if take, 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 then bishop e3, c4, rook g1, pawn g6, and rook g5 is playable. And the only move to hold on to an advantage is apparently f5. And then queenside castle. Okay, yeah, very findable engine. Okay, computer. But knight e6 is played, and this is just a mistake because of queen to a5, queen a4 check, only move. After the king moves, we now take on c4. The thing is, after knight c6, we can't do this. Apparently knight e5 is the move, but I was more concerned about queen h4 and this. But the computer doesn't care, which is pretty funny. Although from a human perspective, this looks very bad. But knight e6, we give a check, king e7, and queen takes c4. And now we're up a pawn. Rook h to d8, we go bishop e3, best move, piling on the pressure. Queen e5 I thought was a big mistake. King f8 is the move I expected, which I thought was very good. I didn't think taking was a good idea, because firstly, we can have take, but more importantly, there's king g8. And now if the bishop retreats, apparently this is good. And if castles, queen e2. I suppose there's also these ideas, but okay. Queen e5, we castle. And after rook d7, big mistake, we have rook to f5, which is the best move by a country mile. Now, what else could we play? We could play a move like rook a to e1, and after black doubles up, then go rook f5. The other move I was considering is rook a to d1, but, I mean, basically, rook f5 is the winning idea. We will have to play it at some point. If we play a move like rook f to e1, the computer, as you can see, thinks black has some chances, maybe. But rook f5, the queen has to move. The computer actually prefers queen f6, giving up the queen, which is pretty hilarious. Queen moves. We go rook d5, slightly inaccurate. Computer preferred taking. After queen takes, well, let's say knight takes, realistically. Oh, then you have this. Then this. And then this. And then this. And then this. Okay, yeah, very interesting. But I go rook d5, queen c6, and I take on c5. D4 is a move. This is a move I saw, but it's overcomplicating the position. Point being, you can't take because of take. But there's no need. There's no need. Bishop c5, knight c5. And here, the computer prefers rook c5 over queen c5. But I thought, well, queen b6, and maybe there's some pressure. I mean, the computer doesn't care. It wants to give up the b2 pawn and go rook to f1, which makes a lot of sense, right? We have so much pressure in this position. But queen c5 I thought was far easier, because after take, if you take, then something like this, king to e8, rook f1, let's say pawn to f6, and, well, then you hang this. So, I mean, how do you defend this? Rook to b8, apparently, trying to create counterplay. But here, just b3, and the game is effectively over. So rook b8, we go b3, and now rook takes d3. As I said, if black tries to play a move like rook to c8, preparing this, then I would just go d4. And then there is no counterplay whatsoever. There is nothing. You have no way into the position. None of your open files work. So, my opponent does what I think is a good idea, taking and trying to create counterplay. King e6. We go pawn to c4, which is very good. Pawn a5 and rook to a7. The pawn cannot be defended. Rook e3. And here, king f2 is a very good move. Computer prefers rook a6 check. Why? Oh, because here you can take with check. And if the king retreats, now this, which I've got to admit, I don't understand the difference. I guess the king is a bit further back. But we go king f2, which I was very happy with because we can prepare rook e1, forcing the rooks off the board. And as I said, this is far easier to win with only one set of rooks, because black, as we saw, could not create counterplay. We push the pawns down the board, nice and simple. Black does not have enough play. As I mentioned, a move like g4 is probably not in this position. In this position is probably good. Although, yeah, the computer does think h5, sacrificing the pawn and trying to push, is a good idea for black, which I wanted to avoid. So I just leave the pawns where they are, right? I make black waste loads of time coming to me. And in the meantime, I just keep on pushing the pawns. Eventually, we get the pawn to c6. We play pawn a6, sacking the pawn, and after take b5, as I explained in the game, it's over. It's over, because I will sweep up the kingside pawns, and my opponent resigns, because all my opponent can do is shuffle, literally all he can do, and I'll take all the pawns, and then push the h-pawn, and the game is over. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned a lot of opening ideas and endgame strategy. If you want to see another very interesting Vienna game, check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.